challenging, trying, difficult, uncertain, unprecedented. Throw some black and white still images and some soft piano in the background and a big corporation virtue signaling about how we're still here for you, and by that they mean you can still buy their stuff. And you have yourself a pandemic commercial. I don't know if you're like me, but I'm kind of sick of them. Had just about enough of that. But what you have to admit is that they're onto something. Life has changed. It's different. And so many have adopted this phrase, the new normal, because they realize this change is probably not going to go back to the way that it was. And if you're anything like me, that's messed with you. I'm a person who loves everything in routine, all my boxes checked, all my things scheduled, and that has been totally shattered. Maybe you're a person who is worried about your financial future in the new normal. Your job isn't as certain, or maybe it's gone. You're wondering what life is going to be like once they start rolling back CERB or wage subsidies. Maybe you're worried about your kids, how the young ones are going to learn to socialize, how the older ones are going to learn if they're learning online, how the oldest ones are going to get a job in the market that exists now. Maybe you're worried about your health. You never thought about it before, but now you walk out the door and there's this low hum of nervousness because you're not sure who's carrying it and how close they're going to get and if someone's going to be an idiot. Life has changed. You come to church, life has changed. I can't see any of your mouths besides Clementine's. It's a challenge. And so I wanted to meditate today on what the Bible has to say about massive change and what the church has done during times of massive change. So to start today, I just want to get a big idea in front of you. The big idea for today is that things are different, but God is not. Things are different, but God is not. We're going to look at a longer piece of text from Numbers 14 to wrap our minds around this big idea today. So I encourage you to follow along with me as I read through the text. The context of this text is that the children of Israel have been brought out of slavery in Egypt by Moses. They have wandered in the wilderness. They've come up against the Red Sea. And then the Egyptian army has come and tried to capture them, but God has separated the Red Sea. They've crossed through. The water has crashed back down on the Egyptians. They're free to go into the wilderness, and they've made it all the way to the brink of the Promised Land. So they send 10 spies in to see what the Promised Land is like. They've heard from God. It's a land flowing with milk and honey, a land that is full of all sorts of resources and beautiful. And so the 10 spies come back, and 2 of them say, yep, just like God said. Flowing with milk and honey, perfect in every way. But there are 8 spies that say, yeah, but the people are giants, and they're going to crush us. And that's where we pick up the text, Numbers 14. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, if only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to each other, we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite assembly, the land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord. Do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. But the whole assembly talked about stoning them. And the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the Israelites. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? I will strike them down with a plague and destroy them, but I will make you into a nation greater and stronger than they." Moses said to the Lord, "Then the Egyptians will hear about it. By your power you brought these people up from among them, and they will tell the inhabitants of the land about it. They have already heard that you, Lord, are with these people, and that you, Lord, have been seen face to face, that your cloud stays over them, and that you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. If you put all these people to death, leaving none alive, the nations who have heard this report about you will say, 'The Lord was not able to bring these people into the land he promised them on oath, so he slaughtered them in the wilderness.' Now may the Lord's strength be displayed, just as you have declared. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love and forgiving sin and rebellion. Yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. In accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people, just as you have pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now." The Lord replied, "I have forgiven them, as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it. But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. Since the Amalekites and the Canaanites are living in the valleys, turn back tomorrow and set out toward the desert along the route to the Red Sea." The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "How long will this wicked community grumble against me? I have heard the complaints of these grumbling Israelites. So tell them, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do the very thing I heard you say. In this wilderness your bodies will fall, every one of you, 20 years old or more, who is counted in the census, who has grumbled against me. Not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb son of Jephunneh and Joshua son of Nun. As for your children that you said would be taken as plunder, I will bring them in to enjoy the land you have rejected." This is God's word. So there are 3 movements to this text. 3 movements are rebellion, repentance, and results. So we're going to walk through each of those movements. And the first of those movements, rebellion, really has 3 parts to it. Those 3 parts are romanticizing the past, fearing the future, and forgetting the true past. Those 3 parts. If you're taking notes, don't worry, those will come up again on the screen later. But let's start walking through them. First, romanticizing the past. We can see this in the second verse of the text when it says, "All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, 'If only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness.'" Now, in psychology, we would call this denial, right? We would say it was looking at the situation and romanticizing the past and not being realistic about what the past actually held. We think about what they're saying. We wish we would have died in Egypt. Okay, well, compare the 2 situations. On the one hand, you have God present in a pillar of cloud or a pillar of fire, like visibly present, who has brought you to the brink of the promised land that he's promised to give you with food the whole way, compared to Egypt, where they were enslaved and where their babies were being killed, where they didn't have all the food that they wanted, they didn't have all the resources they wanted, and yet they wanted to go back there. And we might look at that from a 30,000-foot view and be like, you guys are so dumb. Like, do you not realize the life you have? And even though this life isn't exactly perfect right now, it's better than that. The truth is, we romanticize the past all the time, don't we? Maybe you remember when you were single. If you're a married person, you longed maybe for a relationship. You thought to yourself, it'd be so great to have somebody to talk to or somebody to go out with, somebody to take care of me when I'm sick, somebody to share my bed with me. Until then, you got into a relationship and you remembered all the good things about being single, like how you were free to go wherever you wanted, whenever you wanted, spend your money on whatever you wanted, to not have to be accountable to anyone, to sleep on the couch with Doritos on your chest, or maybe that's just me. And so maybe you broke up with that person, got back to being single, and then you thought to yourself, you know what, it would be really great to have a relationship. Because you romanticize the past, right? You remember the good things about the past, not the negative things about the past. Maybe if you're a little bit older, you think back to your grade school or high school, university years, and you think of those years with just such fond memories. But if you were serious about it, if you dwelt on it for a while, you remember that those weren't the greatest years in many ways. I tried to do this myself. Like I would look back on my high school or my college years and say, that was probably some of the most fun I've had in my life ever. Then I thought about it a little bit more, and I remembered like that was a time where I had so much angst and was not a nice person to be around and was not taking care of myself in most ways. Like I'm thankful that you guys didn't know me back then, besides Will and Jessica, and I'm thankful that they have grace. See, we romanticize the past. We look back and we say, that was so good, when it actually wasn't. So that's part one, romanticizing the past. Second, fearing the future. See this in verse 3. The Israelites say, why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? So they concoct this story, right? They concoct a future story of what's going to happen. Their wives and their children are going to be taken as plunder, which is exactly what was happening in Egypt, right? Like at least at the point they were at, they had these things going for them. Their children and wives were not yet taken as plunder. They didn't know that that was going to happen in the Promised Land, and they had God saying, it's not going to happen to you. And yet what did? They believe that that's what's going to happen when they walk into the Promised Land. Again, maybe from the surface looks pretty foolish, but I think it's the same reason that people buy lottery tickets. Why do people buy lottery tickets? Like any financial advisor will tell you that's not a good investment of your money. So why do people do it? The odds are overwhelming that you won't win any sort of significant money playing the lottery, so why do people do it? It's because they've convinced themselves that something that has almost astronomically impossible odds is actually quite possible for them. And the Israelites were doing the exact same thing in reverse. Instead of thinking that something really good that had almost no possibility of happening was likely for them, they were thinking something that had almost no possibility of happening that was bad was going to happen to them. They convinced themselves the future was not worth finding out because they had built up this story in their mind of what it was going to be like, even though it was nowhere near reality. So romanticizing the past, fearing the future, and the last one is forgetting the true past. We get that in verse 11, when God now is having this dialogue with Moses, and he says, how long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? Essentially, he's saying, Moses, you remember, like when I brought you out of slavery from the most powerful nation on earth? Do you remember when I suspended the laws of nature to separate that sea so you could walk through on dry ground and then let the water come back to its place over your enemies so you could go free? Do you remember when I provided manna every day so you could eat? Did you forget all that? Did these people forget all that? And I wish I could say there's a psychological reason that humans don't remember things like the past very well, but the truth is, it's just unbelief. It's just sin. Every one of us by nature hates God, hates his words, doesn't want to believe any of them. By grace, you believe them through the new man that was given to you at your baptism, but your nature still lives with you and that does not want to hear God. Does not want to remember what God has done for you. So the rebellion of the people was romanticizing the past, fearing the future, and then forgetting the true past. So why do I bring all these up? Because in the same way that we are on the brink of a new world, a new normal, massive change in our life, just like the Israelites were as they thought about going into the promised land, we may be tempted to fall into the same traps. Romanticize the past, to fear the future, or to forget the true past. What could that look like? In a new post-COVID world, maybe large group gatherings are going to be different. We won't be able to do big group evangelism like we used to gather 280 kids up on a set of bleachers, to bring a whole bunch of people into a space to eat together. We may romanticize that past. So we wish it was still like that. Or we might fear the future and say, well, how are we going to do evangelism at all then? Maybe we'll think about how much people wanted to come to church before a pandemic and how much they might want to come to church now. It's hard enough to get someone into the church doors before they were afraid that everyone had a disease that was going to kill them. Now you expect people to come into our doors just because they see some signs? We might romanticize the past and say, it was so much easier. I fear the future and say, how are we going to get people to come to church? In a post-COVID world, people are trusting experts less and less. So what makes any of us think that bringing someone here to let me, the expert, talk about the Bible is going to be believable? Maybe we'll romanticize the past and say, I wish I could just bring them to pastor and pastor would make them a Christian. Or we might fear the future. Maybe that means now I actually have to know how to talk to somebody about this stuff. In the past, we were able to sort of accidentally get into friendships as a congregation because we had so much time together. We were there for a couple hours of setup, a couple hours of teardown, and we had that whole time in the gymnasium with no need to get out for really any reason. And now we've cut down almost all of our setup, almost all of our teardown, and we have to get out of this building in order to let another church in. It might not be as easy to make sort of accidental relationships. It might actually have to be intentional, and we might romanticize the past and say, I loved when I could just sort of be an introvert and float around the church without having to talk to anybody, or fear the future where I might actually have to take the time to call somebody or text them or get in a life group with them in order to have relationship. We fall into these temptations, can't we? Two solutions for you. The first is to remember that often when God takes us out of a situation into a new situation, it's because he's pushing us to something better. What if God is not allowing us to do outreach in some of the ways that we used to do it, that we learn to do outreach in a way that speaks to our culture? What if God is not letting people believe me when I talk because he wants you to know the words to say so that you can tell them they can believe you? What if God is helping us appreciate community enough that we'll actually intentionally seek it out rather than show up for church on Sunday and that's enough? But the second is a far better solution. Not just to think that life might get better for us or for the church because of this massive change, but to remember what the Israelites forgot, the true past, what God has done to get us here. First, on a micro level, what he's done for this congregation. He took a pastor through a season of massive change, of moving to a new country to be a pastor where there was no congregation, so that 20 years later, there could be a congregation here where you could hear the word preached truthfully. Most of you were not there when he started that church, but you've come because of that work. God has preserved this church. And if you know this, this is not the first time our church body has tried to start a church in Mississauga. It's failed twice before. And yet God has continued this church up to this point. He's brought together this community of people so you can love them and they can in turn love you. But on a macro level, just think about what God has done in the past. Think about specifically people like Abraham. Remember Abraham's story? Abraham was living a life of unbelief. He's actually an unbeliever. Until God called him out and said, "Go that way, I'm going to make you a father of many nations." Some of you are worried about what your life is going to look like over the next couple of years, what your family is going to look like over the next couple of years. I'm sure Abraham was too. But God was faithful to Abraham and did make him the father of many nations, and not just a nation on earth, but a nation of Christians, those who had the same faith as he had, even to today. Think of what he did through Joseph. Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his brothers, and then in slavery was accused of rape, and then thrown in prison, but finally, by God's grace, ascended to the second position in Egypt. You think Joseph was suffering through massive change? But God was faithful through it. And as he himself would later say, it was all meant for evil, but God meant it for good. About David, the eighth son of his father, the nobody, the runt of the family, who became the king of Israel, not because he was so great, but because God called him to be that. Maybe you're thinking right now, in this new world, I'm not sure exactly what role I play in my church. I'm not sure if I can be the one who has the words to say, I'm kind of young, or I'm a new Christian, or I haven't really taken the time to train myself in those things. And yet, what did God do through David? Made him the greatest king of Israel. What about Isaiah? Isaiah was a normal priest. He was doing his work in the church until God showed up to him, and God's glory filled the temple, and God called Isaiah to a service of being the greatest prophet who ever lived, basically. If you read his book, it's the most impressive book in the Old Testament, I would say. And it also contains the most direct prophecies about Jesus Christ. Prophecies like the virgin will be with child and give birth to a son. He will be Prince of Peace, Wonderful Counselor. He was stricken for our transgressions, smitten and afflicted. All those things come from Isaiah. Maybe you've been doing normal church work and you've been comfortable with it for a lot of years, and God is calling you to something different, but it is for your good, for the good of those around you. About Mary, the teenage girl who had a plan for her family that went awry, yet God accomplished the greatest good that ever happened to the world through her change of plans. Through Jesus' disciples, normal guys working a normal job who were called to an extraordinary position as not just the followers of Jesus, but then the apostles who would preach his message and share it through scriptures. Saul of Tarsus, who thought he was doing all the right things for the church, but when God stepped in and changed his life, he found out that all the things he thought he was doing that were good for the church were actually not good at all, and that God was calling him to something different. Or, of course, most importantly, Jesus himself, who went through a season of massive change when he became human, suffered, crucified, died, buried, and rose again for the greatest good that any of us have ever experienced. Right now, it might be easy to romanticize the past, fear the future, or forget the true past. But brothers and sisters, don't do that. The past was great, and God blessed us. But it's a time of change. And the future is scary. I'm scared of it. I'm not really sure how to be a pastor at this time. But I know what God has done in the past. And I know he'll continue to do it in the future. So that's the rebellion. Don't worry, the next two parts are much shorter. Second, we have the repentance. We get that from the text here, verse 15 and 16, where Moses is talking to God, and he says, if you put all these people to death, leaving none alive, the nations who have heard this report about you will say, the Lord was not able to bring these people into the land he promised them on oath, so he slaughtered them in the wilderness. And the Lord replied, I have forgiven them as you asked. And if you're paying attention, you realize there's something weird about this repentance. It doesn't really happen. Like the nation of Israel is rebelling against God. They're complaining, let's saying, go back to Egypt. And they never say they're sorry. All we get is Moses coming to God and saying, Please forgive them. And God does it. That's not normally how we think of repentance, right? We think of repentance as me saying sorry, God forgiving me. So what is this text teaching us? Well, this text is teaching us a huge thing that I think we forget, and that is that your sin is my problem. I'll say it again. Your sin is my problem. Just think about what sins you fall into. At least at some level, I am responsible for that. Not just because I'm your pastor, but because I'm a fellow Christian with you. I should be encouraging you. I should be praying for you. I should be checking in with you. I should be watching out for you. And because we are part of literally one body, united by the body and blood that we take in the Lord's Supper, in the same way that if your hand does something wrong, your whole body is responsible for it. If you do something wrong, I am responsible for it. And if you think I'm just making this up, think back to the Lord's Prayer that we just studied, where Jesus told us to pray, forgive us our sins. Not forgive me my sins, forgive us our sins. And think back to the very beginning of the Bible, where Eve takes the fruit as tempted by the devil, and who is held responsible? Adam. The book of Romans said, in Adam, sin came into the world, and Adam all die, even though Eve was the one who committed the first sin. As Western people, we don't like that. We like to think everything is individual, right? You're responsible for your actions, and you get either the praise or the condemnation for whatever you do. But the Bible doesn't talk that way. It does say that every person is accountable for their own sin and that no one will be punished for someone else's sin, but it also makes it very obvious that your sin is my problem. We're starting to understand this, I think, a little bit because of some of the racial issues that we're dealing with. We're starting to understand the idea that a person can commit a crime, but that other people are responsible. That maybe that person didn't have the privileges or opportunities that other people had, and so they were led to do that. And while no one person is responsible for the system that put them in that position, everyone, therefore, is responsible for the system. And so that crime, while that person did commit it, is maybe not entirely their problem. But let's get back to Moses. Moses comes to God and says, forgive them, and God says, I'll do it. What do we learn about that? Well, I think there's a micro-level application and a macro-level application again. Micro-level application, you sinned this week, and God didn't kill you. Why? Well, it's not because you immediately felt sorry for it or immediately repented or immediately acknowledged your sin, but because God is gracious and all your brothers and sisters have been praying this week and every week, forgive us our sins. So thank God for your church. They prayed for you. God heard them. God spared you what your sin deserved. But on a macro level, the Bible tells us that Jesus is the advocate before the Father, interceding for us like a defense attorney in a courtroom. That whenever you sin, whether you acknowledge it right away, whether you realize you sinned, or whether you're necessarily even sorry for it right away, Jesus is there to say, yes, I have paid for that sin also. And because Jesus does that, you are forgiven. Not because you asked for it, because you earned it, but because God just gives it to you. So what's the application for us then as we think about massive change? We're going to sin. We're going to sin against each other. We're going to do those three things that the nation of Israel fell into. So let's remember God's forgiveness, which starts us every day with a clean slate, every moment with a clean slate. Not that we are living up to some expectations, but that God has unleashed us with the freedom that comes from the gospel to live for him and for his kingdom. And then that we would pray for the forgiveness of each other. As we all make mistakes trying to figure this thing out, we'd be generous, kind, and patient with each other. So that's the repentance, rebellion, repentance, and finally, results. God says right at the end of the text to Moses, as for your children that you said would be taken as plunder, I will bring them in to enjoy the land you have rejected. So what God says is, I forgive you. You're right with me. But if you're not going to follow me, there still are consequences. And so he sends every person over the age of 20 back into the wilderness for 40 years until they all die, and those 20-year-olds are 60, and they get to lead the people into the promised land. 40 years. We had maybe 4 months of being away from each other and being away from our little promised land here where we hear God's word. 40 years they had to suffer, and their children inherited the kingdom that was waiting for them, the promised land. And this is meant to be a warning for us. The truth is, God is going to do his work in Mississauga. He's going to do it. He knows those who are his. His sheep know his voice. He will preach to them through somebody's mouth. At one time, he even used the donkey. Christians will come to know the good news of the gospel in this city. What this story asks us is, will we participate? Or will we romanticize the past? Will we fear the future? Will we forget the past and wait until our church dissipates? Wait until we get too small to not be able to afford to pay a pastor or to pay for a building? Or will we dig in and say, I don't get this, I don't know this, but I'm going to try this? I may be scared, I may be uncomfortable, but God's calling me to this. And he has been faithful to every one of my forefathers and mothers who came before me, and he will be faithful to me also. They weren't willing to do it. And so they didn't inherit the promised land. Their children did. Let's not let that happen to us. So how do we do it? Well, the how comes from those very ordinary things that we read in Hebrews 13. Those daily grind things that don't look that extraordinary, but they are the things that God calls us to and the things that he says by which he will grow a Christian community, that people will know by our love for each other that we are followers of Jesus, and they will come to know that gospel as well. So I want to walk slowly back through that text and just remind you of those basic things that God has called us to. First of all, to keep on loving one another. Not just to have feelings of love for each other, but to have actions of love for each other. To find ways to serve one another. To be in each other's lives. To know what's going wrong. To know how to maximize things that are going right. To show hospitality to strangers. Not just to our members, but to the people who live next door to you or down the street or work next to you. To be kind to them and generous to them because, he says, some people have even shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. You may think it doesn't matter that much, but God sees every action. He calls us to that hospitality. He says to continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them, and those who were mistreated as if you were suffering. And in here, you don't want to see necessarily specifically suffering or prison, but that you are feeling the same feelings that the rest of your brothers and sisters are feeling. It's easy at this time, especially because of the nature of massive change, to find yourself on one side of the spectrum or whatever, or other side of whatever the issue is, and say that those people on the other side, they don't get it. They're foolish. God calls us to see them and to feel like them, to know their position so well that we could explain it back to them. And even if we don't agree, to continue loving them through it. It says, honor your marriages. Some of you are married, and that's been tested during this time. It may be hard to spend as much time as you have had to spend with your spouse in your house. God says, work on that. And if you need help, find other Christians who will encourage you in that. Find another couple who will have dinner with you, share God's forgiveness, share struggles, share encouragement. Keep your lives free from the love of money. It's easy right now to think about money. But remember, the God who has provided for you in the past will continue providing for you in the present. So say with confidence, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. Then remember your leaders. That doesn't just mean me or those who we've elected into leadership positions in our church. When he says this, he says, remember all those leaders who have gone before us. All those who have gone back for thousands of years trusting in what Jesus has said and leading their church through it. Because, he says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Jesus knew when a pandemic was coming. He's known when all the pandemics were coming, and he has led his church through it. So trust your leaders who hear his voice. And then finally, strengthen your hearts by grace. Hear God's word. Hear his forgiveness. Believe it. Walk free from your guilt and shame, knowing that the God who has given up his own Son for you will give you all things that are necessary for your well-being, giving you a life of significance and importance, all because of what Jesus has done. You can imagine standing at the foot of the cross, how horrific that would have looked, how terrifying it would have been, the massive change that was staring John and the Marys in the face. What is life going to be like now that Jesus is dead? But that most horrific moment became the greatest moment in all human history. So let's remember that God who did that in the past can do it in the future, in this new normal. Let's pray. Lord Jesus, you have walked with us to this point in our world's history, this point in our congregation's history, to this point in each of our personal histories, and you are continuing to be faithful even now by giving us a church to gather with, the word to be heard, your sacraments to be received, and you are bringing more people into our church family regularly. We ask that you continue these blessings because we do not deserve them. By our own actions, we would have thrown them away. So give us faith to move forward, to not romanticize the past, to not fear the future, but to remember your faithfulness to all generations. We ask this in your name. Amen.